My name is Joe Peroni, and this is the Rise Above Project. And today we're going to talk about identifying risk factors, stressors, and unmet needs, which may lead to complex post-traumatic stress disorder. We could also call it developmental stress disorder, attachment disorder. But by the way, none of these things are actually in the DSM, but they should be. And it's been worked on for about 30 years. And for other reasons we're not going to mention today, most of them political, that it's not in the DSM. Now, I wish I could go a week without getting to a client that has not been diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. I see this all the time. That has to be one of the laziest diagnoses I've ever seen. Because if you look at that, what you're really seeing is a symptom of trauma in their childhood. Now, the problem with that is, of course, is that the treatment is going to be completely wrong. You know, they'll give people like that breathing exercises. And how does anybody think that a breathing exercise, for example, is going to help a person that has a lot of physiological and emotional changes due to trauma in their childhood? The breathing exercise is going to be just a very, very small and a very short-term treatment. It's not actually going to get to the root cause of the problem. Now, if you don't like all these terms like developmental stress disorder, CPTSD, throw it all away. We don't need it. The only thing you actually need to know for today is we're going to talk about some risk factors that can lead to people having some really heavy baggage that people take into relationships, and they try to have good lives, and they try to pick good people, and they try to be a good person, but there's so many things holding them back. And we're going to go over a bunch of those today, because a lot of them are pretty obvious, but not all of them. A lot of them go underneath the radar. Therefore, when we look at complex post-traumatic stress disorder, there's a lot of therapists that are still in the dark about what that even is and what could be so stressful. Because most of the time when we look at PTSD, we're expecting some military type of thing where there's a big event or there's a shooting or something to that effect. And it really doesn't have to be that at all. It could be a lot of other things, and we'll get into that. Before we do that, first, I want to talk about some what I would call essential wisdom. Some are going to be factual, and some are going to be philosophical. But either way, I think it's very important that we take a look at that before we dive into the actual risk factors and stressors. So, number one, we are all thrown into this world the same exact way. We're naked, needy, and we're fully dependent on our caregivers. Number two, we come into this world with only two fears, and that's the fear of falling and the fear of loud noises. That's it. So everything else is learned, which sounds disheartening in one sense, but on the other sense it's good, because if it's learned through proper treatment and awareness, it can be unlearned. Number three, it's absolutely 100% natural for all beings, for all living things, to have the desire to be what they're supposed to be, to grow, to be happy, to reach their full potential, to survive the best they can. However, number four, a human being's capacity to reach their full potential diminishes in direct correlation with the disintegration and the corruption of their relationship to the other people, which tends to be their caregivers, their relationship with themselves, and with the relationship with their environment. By the time a child is born, the very first day, they can already start to assimilate mistrust in the world and their caregivers. And that goes very deep into who they are. And that's the child amnesia stage. So you may not be able to figure out why that is, because I see this with a lot of clients, they don't know why. But if you look back, you could kind of figure out what was going on with their caregivers, and you could see they probably had a lot of reasons to mistrust their caregivers. So it starts at a very, very early age. Number 5, a human being's higher intelligence and probably awareness also leads them to believe that they are the problem and that their environment is not the problem. Therefore, many people unconsciously act against their own best interest, and again, unconsciously, but willfully choose self-destructive behaviors. Why might this be? Well, let's look at number 6. Let's talk about the godfather of psychology, Freud. I'm paraphrasing here, but he said something to the effect of, in joining civilization, we agree to suppress our natural instincts. Again, what are our natural instincts? To grow, to be happy, to reach our full potential, to be who we're supposed to be. But unconsciously, we kind of give all that up if we live in an environment that's very invalidating. Now, I don't know if Freud meant this literally, to say we agree to suppress our natural instincts, but it doesn't matter for our conversation today. We do it anyway, meaning that we join with our caregivers. So if our caregivers look at us in a way that doesn't show that they love us, support us, and they have joy when they see us, they don't try to meet all our needs, they seem distracted, have a lot of anxiety, they have other things on their mind, they don't put us first, we start to feel that there's something wrong with us. So the mirror that we're looking at is our caregivers, and if it shows that we're not very good, we don't have the ability to say that they're the problem. We say we're the problem. So we start to already, at a very young age, have our self-esteem destroyed. And we already start down the pathway of turning against ourselves and doing very negative things, and we also take it out on other people. So number 7, if a child has developed in an unsafe environment where he or she was trying to just survive, to manage their unending pain, or they were trying to cope with their unmet needs, there will be changes, for sure. There will be changes in their brain and their nervous systems. Again, they will learn to distrust. They will learn not to have self-esteem. They will have emotional dysregulation issues. They will have cognitive issues. So with that, let's move on to the antecedents and contributing factors to CPTSD, developmental disorder. We can call them unmet needs, neuroticism. Again, if you like the words, great, use them. If you don't like it, just say, we got a lot of heavy baggage to deal with when we try to have a life and try to get through it, and to be good people and to also have good relationships. So keep this in mind. So number 1, one that people wouldn't think of, excessive admiration for the child, putting them on a pedestal. That can lead to entitlement, and it leads to narcissism. And don't we see enough of that today? You know, just as an aside, it's not always that they admire the child so much. What I have seen is that parents are trying to protect the child so much that they are destroying them. I'll give you an example of what happens in my life as a therapist. So I'm not the most feminine of therapists, obviously. I'm a masculine man. If I'm doing therapy on a child that had abuse in his life and the abuser was a man, and let's say this boy has difficulty dealing with me because of the tone of my voice, let's say my voice is relatively deep, and he tells his mother, I'm afraid. He has a deep voice. The mother, excessively trying to just take care of the child, will say, oh, no therapy with that guy, because of the deep voice, not considering that 50% of human beings are males. So if you try to get this kid into sports, let's say, we're talking about a male, if I try to get a boy into sports, who are the football coaches, the wrestling coaches, the boxing coaches, the hockey coaches? Most likely they're going to be men. So you'll take a mom that takes the boy out and says, listen, there's no more men in his life because he has an issue with that. And I've said in previous shows, one of the most difficult things a therapist has to do is to try to get people to make decisions in the here and now, and to act and feel in the here and now. And not to say this person's in front of me, well, 10 years ago there was abuse, and the kind of person looked like you, had the same hairstyle as you, so therefore I'm going to be emotionally dysregulated now, and I'm never going to get better because of that, because I refuse to talk to anybody that looks or sounds like you. So that's number one. Number two, injustice and discrimination, which I think is really interesting because most people don't think about this as being a risk factor for CPTSD. And I had to think about this one a lot. And it's obviously very true, and especially in our country, because we try to tell people to get over their stuff and that it doesn't matter, but it matters a lot. Now, one of the things I find really interesting about injustice and discrimination is that there's been a lot of studies in the United States. They spend a lot of money on trying to deal with the relatives who have ties to the Holocaust. And this makes sense, and we understand to a very large degree of what injustice and discrimination does throughout history, throughout somebody's family line. We know this. A lot of money spent on descendants of the Holocaust. See if you could find any money that was used to study the descendants of slavery in this country. By the way I said it, I think you know the answer. There's almost no money spent on that. Again, I'm not going to tell you why. I'm not here to tell you how to think. But again, psychology, you can't separate psychology from the politics, unfortunately. Moving on, number three, isolation from other children. And this can come in a lot of different ways. Let's bring this up to date. You know, you see kids, life is in front of you. Not anymore. These kids have their head always in a phone or some type of device. It's really funny. I live in Las Vegas. School just started here. I'm driving past all these kids waiting for the bus. Really interesting stuff because none of them are talking. They all have these headphones on, or they got their head down looking into their devices or their phone. I don't know what they're doing, probably checking in with their mother, seeing how, are you okay? Like, come on, give me a break. You're 12. You don't need to check in with your mother every 5 seconds. They certainly don't have friends. They're not talking to anybody on their sides, which is really interesting too, because Las Vegas has a lot of schools. You don't have to travel that far to go to school. I remember walking, it sounds like a boomer thing, but anyway, I'm not a boomer. I'm Generation X. But besides that, the fact that I'm not seeing a bunch of these kids walking to school, or even if you're on the cusp of whether you should take the bus or not, if good parenting skills would say, hey, listen, go meet up with some of your friends, knock on their door. By the time you get to school, you'll be walking into the school with like 10 of your friends. You should do that. They shouldn't be sitting there with the headphones on like that. So again, we are creating a group of children that are going to be growing up with incredible unmet needs, because we do have a need to connect to human beings. And if you start at a very young age not connecting to human beings, you're not going to be able to get over the shyness and nervousness of breaking through to another human being. Number 4, lack of respect for needs. This is an interesting one too, because if you're a child and you need something and you verbalize that to your parents, but let's say your parent cannot provide that need, instead of having an emotional conversation to be able to say, I understand you, I know why you want that, I know why you need that, which would be beneficial, a lot of times parents don't know what to do because it's a blow to their ego. So they will try to downgrade the child by saying, that's not a need. You don't need that. And that's because if the parent can't provide it, they feel bad. So then they try to put that negativity on the child. And they try to say to the child, listen, you ask for too much, you're spoiled. Only a spoiled child would want that. You want new sneakers to start off school? Get out of here. You want more than 2 pairs of pants? What's wrong with you? You know? And so the kid grows up with this thought of having no needs, like they shouldn't have needs. And a child like that gets into relationships that quite possibly can be abusive because they don't ask for the things that they want, number one. And number two, they figure they don't deserve to have anything, so they don't bother to ask or to look for somebody else who can provide those needs for them. Number 5, lack of guidance. We see this a lot with parents who are extremely permissive, parents who just they're checked out, they have anxiety, they're worried about their own life, but we also see this with parents who are trying to be their children's friend, which is an absolute disaster. Number 6, lack of warmth. Again, children need to know that they're loved, cared for, and supported. Unfortunately, when we look at parental guidance here that does show a lack of warmth, a lot of times it's psychology's fault, right? Because throughout the years, there's still this thought out there that like if a baby cries, that you should just let them cry themselves to sleep, you know, because you don't want to spoil the kid, kind of a thing. Like you just say, go out there and do your thing. When the child gets older, if they cry or if they have a fear, it's just like, just handle it yourself. And over time, we found out that that's not true. We see this too with a lot of parents that do this timeouts with their children. You know, again, that shows a lack of warmth. Now, I'm not saying you can't do it in a positive way. You can, but most likely parents don't. What they do is they hear their child, their emotion in some way or their action annoys them. So they say, you go over there. It's a timeout. It's not a timeout for the child. It's a timeout for the parent because they don't want to be bothered. So what the child learns is that their feelings, their emotions, their actions are not okay to the parent. So in order to please the parent, they have to be something else. So they have to start learning how to hide their emotions. They have to start learning how to hide what they feel, what they think, because they're trying to coordinate who they are with the parent in order to be accepted. So if the parent finds them unacceptable and they ship them off, the only way the kid is going to feel like they're going to get their attachment is if they please the parent. Again, lack of warmth. We found out that timeouts for kids is very destructive. It borders on neglectful. Moving on, number 7. Overprotection of the child, where a child's not allowed to go out and make mistakes. And this can start at a very early age. If a parent is overly protective with a child, we're looking at the autonomy versus shame and doubt stage, which happens between about 1.5 years old to 3. So if you're doing that to your child, even at that very young age, you're looking at maybe, unless something gets resolved, you're looking at lifelong self-esteem issues. And it's going to be an extreme challenge for them to break out of their shell to do something new. Moving on, number 8, parental arguments and hostility in the home. I think this is self-explanatory. It's going to scare kids a lot when their parents are arguing, if there's hostility in the home between parents, or if the parent is acting that way towards other people. It definitely puts a kid in an unsafe environment. Number 9, too much or too little responsibility on a child. Again, if they have no responsibility, they're not going to learn to do anything. And they're not going to have any self-esteem because they have no competence in anything. On the other part, if you kind of, in a sense, parentify the child where he or she has to do too much work around the home and has to manage the parent, there's no way that they can fulfill that responsibility, so it creates anxiety. Again, and this person later on down the road might get a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder. It's not that. It's a trauma, it's a stressor from their childhood. Unkept promises. I don't think anybody would argue with this. It's self-explanatory. If you want to trust your parents, you're going to have trouble doing that if they lie to you a lot and they don't follow through. Number 11, drugs and alcohol in the home. Again, I think this is pretty self-explanatory. This is one that doesn't go under the radar. This is pretty obvious, or at least it should be. If a child is afraid that somebody's going to be drunk or come home drunk, they're scared to death all the time. And then what happens is they get a diagnosis of ADHD. Like, who would have thought? They can't concentrate, with some drunk idiot running around who's creating an unsafe environment. That doesn't make sense either. Half these therapists that give away these strange diagnoses, and they're not looking for all these other risk factors. Again, the child is going to try to manipulate in some way or manage the person in the home who has the alcohol or drug problem, because they're figuring if I can be a good enough kid, they wouldn't be doing this. Or if I can act a certain way and I act in a perfect way, they won't be angry, they won't be vicious towards me, they won't be hostile. Of course, that doesn't work, and then that creates this whole other cascading of negative events, such as learned helplessness, having a victim mentality, because nothing you do is good enough and it doesn't work. Number 12, the emotionally unstable parent. Again, I think this is pretty obvious, so let's move on. Number 13, inconsistent parenting. Again, kids need to know, they need to have requirements, they need to have structure in their life. It's very interesting. I just did a conference the other day, and one of the things they talked about is just the basics. When somebody's traumatized when they're young, it's like they have trouble eating on time or eating in a way that's healthy. They have trouble waking up. They have trouble going to bed. They have trouble staying asleep. So some of these things are so incredibly basic, but we need to look at those. Poor role modeling. Again, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Moving on, let's look at poverty and lack of resources, which again, I think that flies underneath the radar. But this is very important. If a child is growing up in an environment where everything is micromanaged, including their food, they're going to have issues about having their needs met. And they won't even want to try to meet their own needs as they grow up. They're going to feel very guilty about going out and buying something for themselves or buying something for somebody else. So this can have extremely negative effects on their self-esteem, and it affects, again, it's a lot of heavy baggage to go into relationships with if you come from an environment where you had a lack of resources. Moving on, a caregiver that's gone to jail or has mental illness. Again, very important. People don't think about this. This is one for me. My father did go to jail. I was so young, I don't remember, so people would say, well, that doesn't matter. Actually, it does matter, because your personality is formed by the time you're 6 years old. So the fact that my father wasn't there, I would say that he was probably in jail somewhere between when I was 1 to 3 years old, through a lot of heavy developmental time, which is really important. But I don't remember my father being gone, honestly. I had to be told that my father wasn't there for part of my childhood. So that's really interesting to me. I can't say a lot about it because I honestly have not one memory of it. But that's one of the things about CPTSD, is that it's easier to have a memory of something. It's hard to have a memory of something that didn't happen. So if there was nothing there and you don't, it's hard to remember that. Anyway, moving on. I just did that for other people if you've been in that situation. The separation or loss of a caregiver. Again, it could be through jail, it could be through death. I think we could all understand, how important that would be and how that would be a stressor to a child. Domestic abuse, there's nothing to argue about here. Domestic abuse is going to be a problem. Sexual, and here are the big ones that are not under the radar. This is right up front that people should understand. Sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse, psychological abuse, all the biggies. Well, let me add something here. Again, I wish I could go a week without doing an assessment on a person who, let's say there was sexual abuse. Again, we get this stupidity in the United States with these kids going stranger danger, it's all about that. No, I'm not saying that doesn't happen, but most of the sexual abuse, the emotional abuse, the physical abuse, the psychological abuse happens inside the home. It's about 90%. So if you want to know who the perpetrator is, look at the father, like by percentage. Look at the stepfather, look at the uncle. Obviously that sounds sexist, right? It could be the mother, I'm not saying no, but the chances of sexual abuse, typically it's going to be the male. That's the way it is. But here's the other part that I can add to this. Yes, this is a massive risk factor and stressor that creates CPTSD and developmental stress disorder. 100%. But here's the part that creates it even more, is that behind every stepfather that's been raping their kid, I have found that there's a mother in the home that's looking the other way, that knows for sure that it's happening. Because it's an ongoing thing. And for whatever reason, none of them good, that they allow this to go on. And every woman that I've talked to about this, they have told me, and again, I'm a man, so I don't know, and it's not my experience, but almost every single woman I've talked to about this said what's worse than the sexual abuse is the fact that their mother looks them in the eye and says, don't worry about it, it's okay, or I don't believe it's happening, or if it is happening, it's your fault. That is the risk factor right there. It's the invalidation of the child. That is it. Because we're going to talk about on another show what can make a person resilient. And it's not always the actual incident. It's not the traumatic event. But it's who's there for you after the traumatic event. Who is the person who cares about you afterwards? That's the important part. And what I found out, especially when it deals with sexual abuse, there is somebody at home going, I don't care, no big deal, deal with it because I need to get my bills paid or whatever the heck is going on. Continuing, another risk factor, bullying. I think that's self-explanatory. Moving on, major health issues or accidents with the caregivers. I've talked to people before that have had a mother or father that they've had to take care of at a very, very young age, to where they ended up being the parent because their parent was in a major car accident or something like this, and they couldn't actually take care of themselves. So the child becomes the parent over the parent's lifespan. So again, that's a major stressor. I want to throw in adverse childhood experiences test. Now, I'm not going to go over that because I've done multiple shows on that, but just to say that those are like 10 other stressors that you could look into. Again, the invalidation of the child. And the two big ones here that I really want to take a little bit of time to talk about is immobilization, number one, and that there's no defined end to the pain. What they found out is many times, now I have seen some studies on this, I don't know if you could say for sure, but studies do indicate that on 9/11, when the towers came down, those people running away, they actually had less PTSD than the people who weren't there. And they said part of that is because those people, at least, they were not immobilized. They felt like they had some agency, they had some control, they had some power. In other words, they were able to run. And they, at some point, they stopped running and they were with a group of people. So you had social support and you had the fact that they were running, they were getting the physicality out of their system. So I think that's very important. In a lot of the stressors that we're talking about today, again, going back to the very beginning, the philosophical part, you're born naked, needy, and fully dependent upon your caregivers. So if you are in an environment where you need your caregivers to live, you are in an environment where you're trying to survive, but you cannot survive on your own, you're basically a prisoner of war. So what happens is you are immobilized. You are in a position where you have no strength, no power, and no agency. So you learn to be a victim. You learn helplessness. And on top of that, which makes it worse, there's no real defined end to your pain. Now, I'm going to name just a small example, which is very minor compared to the major stuff we're talking about today, but it's the only one I can think of. So like, I don't like MRIs, right? Like my shoulders are a little wide for the one, and if I have to put my hands over my head, I have a little trouble breathing. And besides that, the thing is this close to my face, so I can't stand it. The last time I had an MRI, this person was amazing, because what they would do is they would talk me through on the headphones. They would say, in this particular part, it's going to be 30 seconds long, and then it will stop. And then there's going to be a break. Then you're going to hear some loud noises, and this is going to take 45 seconds. So what it did was it gave me a goal, and it gave me a defined end to each situation. Whereas when I went for an MRI a long time ago, I was freaking out because I was getting to a point where my oxygen was getting cut off. I was feeling a thing where I couldn't breathe, and I had no way to figure out how long I had to try to survive for. And then, of course, that raised my anxiety level. But the last time I went in, like I said, they gave me very defined goals. You got 30 seconds, you got 45 seconds, you got this, you got that. And it made me get through it very easily. So whoever is learning this right now, I'm glad that this information is getting out there, because in an MRI, guess what? You're immobilized. And a guy like me, I want to fight. I want to be able to at least have some type of power, even if I don't. And the fact that I was immobilized is not very good for me. So moving on. More stressors and risk factors. If the child was forced to self-soothe by themselves, again, very important, because a lot of parents, when they see their child, it's more like, a lot of times it's get over it, and they just put the kid in the other room. If you're forced to self-soothe all the time, you're going to feel like there's something wrong with you, and your feelings and emotions are unacceptable. If they're unacceptable to others, they're going to be unacceptable to you, and it's going to be hard to make decisions in your life. If you're a child and you had to be forced to hide your true self, and you could look at this anything. Maybe someone is gay and they have to hide that from their parents. It could be anything. Let's say you want to go to college and you have parents that didn't go to college, and they are somehow have such low self-esteem that it's somehow an affront to them because you want to do better. It's like, so it becomes that. Maybe you come from a family where there's not anybody that's really successful, but maybe you want to be successful. Well, maybe you feel like you have to keep that to yourself because you don't want to hear the negativity about, oh, you can't do that. There's no way you can do that. Only those types of people do that, not you, right? So it's like this crab in a bucket theory, where if you come from an environment where nobody's successful, but you want to be successful, or there's nobody in your family that's ever been a doctor or a lawyer, and that's something you aspire to be, they're going to probably say that you can't do it, when they're in fact saying that, no, I can't do it, and I have a low self-esteem, so I'm going to say you can. So you might want to hold that down because you don't want all the extra pressure on you. But in doing so, you end up hurting yourself in the long run. Let's use one more, because again, the show's 33 minutes long. I always make these shows long. Did you ever feel like you had to prove yourself over and over again to be worthy of love? And if you did, this started in your childhood, and you need to take a look at that, because as you go through your life up into adulthood, if you feel like you have to prove something all the time to be loved, number one, you're trying to impress the wrong people, number one. And number two, if you feel that way, you're not going to be able to prove things all the time. And so you're going to be in a position where you don't love yourself. At my age, I do work with people at that age that are coming to the end, and they have to maybe retire from a job that they've had for many years, and they're already starting to hate their life and hate themselves because they identify as what they do for a living. And if that's true, and they had this job and that's who they are, then they like themselves enough. What happens when you lose your job? Now you're lost. So you're going to have to learn to love yourself for who you are. So again, real quick, today we're looking at identifying risk factors, stressors, unmet needs, which lead to what? It leads to anxiety, neuroticism, CPTSD, developmental stress disorder. Again, most of this, not in the DSM, but should be. And a lot of the things I gave you today fly underneath the radar, but you have to look at it, because if you're noticing things in your life that are difficult, look a little deeper, because not every trauma is a major one. It's not where, somebody punched you in the face 50 times. Like, that's not the only trauma in the world. Some of them are very emotional, and they're ones that you maybe have not thought of before. So I hope today was valuable for you. I'm Joe Peroni. This is the Rise Above Project. Please subscribe and tell a friend. Thank you.